Well, I hate to say it, ladies and gentlemen, the day came and the day went. We knew exactly that South Africa was going to get hit with the 30% tariffs because, well, the ANC made it rather obvious. They continued to sit there making excuses until the 11th hour. And to be frank, you only start making diplomatic excuses when you know the outcome is inevitable. But before we get on to the main story of today, can I yet again remind you, it's a Saturday, ladies and gentlemen. I don't usually do videos on a Saturday, although this is becoming more regularly, so do subscribe to the channel. Reward me for my efforts. So, what exactly has gone on? Well, according to the news, dozens of countries were hit overnight with tariffs, but South Africa was amongst the hardest hit. It's also important to recognize that other countries hit were like Syria, Iraq, Beirut. Like, we're putting ourselves in a very, should we say, very weird bracket of peers. But in any case, this is all being done because Trump is attempting to reshape global trade in favor of American industry, and he's looking to penalize ideological enemies and reward allies who basically play ball. So the new tariffs will target steel, aluminium, automobiles, food products, and many other items. Now, what this actually translates into is a 30% penalty, which will make key exports to the United States, well, to be frank, uncompetitive. Now, the ANC is attempting to minimize this by saying, well, we're not alone. Many countries have been hit by tariffs, so we're all in it together. You know, their usual communist rubbish. Now, you've got to ask the question, why South Africa has been amongst the hardest hit? And the actual answer is a lot easier to understand. And it is because of the geopolitical rivalries. In other words, China, Russia, Iran, and the fact that South Africa has become openly hostile to a key US ally, noticeably Israel. Now, as the ENCA and Daily Investor reported, this was not random. South Africa has been warned for months, and now Trump has acted. In those months where South Africa was warned, it did nothing. So what exactly has gone on? Well, the numbers, to be frank, are going to be brutal. As you know, the US is South Africa's second largest export destination after China, with over 1.8 billion rand in goods exported to the US annually. Now, a significant portion of this is subject to steep tariffs, making South African products non-competitive in American shelves. So, what products are we talking about specifically? Well, machinery and metals, citrus and wine, and many agricultural goods. So, as you can expect, the industry likely to be impacted the most is farming, probably John Steenhuisen's ministry. Now, according to Times News Business, investor confidence in South Africa has plummeted by over 30% since the tariffs were announced, and that was just the announcement. Now, unfortunately, as the tariffs have kicked in, markets are now seeing this as a signal that South Africa is on the wrong side of global trade, and specifically the global trade war, and that it has no strategy to pivot or to fix or mend relations, which, to be frank, means that South Africa is now a no-go zone, specifically for investment. Now, the South African government knew this was coming for some time. US trade representatives issued warnings, business leaders pleaded for engagement, and experts urged DIRCO to repair diplomatic ties to Washington. And what did the ANC do? Well, it insisted on unilateral negotiations, sidelining its own GNU parties. I did a video on this where the DA suggested that they had actually been cut out of the negotiations, with negotiations centering firmly on the ANC. Now, the ANC itself refused to adapt its foreign policy despite US concerns about South Africa's pro-Iran, anti-Israel stance, and have failed to secure a deal or exemptions. Unlike many other countries, he used diplomacy to shield key sectors. Now, unfortunately, what this means is that there is no trade deal, there's no protection, and there's no tariff exemptions. And to add injury to insult, the carbon border tax South Africa was trying to push as a green incentive also dead in the water. So, the DA has come out swinging because, as I said, it's John Steenhuisen's ministry that's probably going to be hit the worst. Now, in an opinion piece issued on ENCA, the DA lambasted the ANC for what they classed as diplomatic incompetence, ignoring months of warnings and allowing ideological obsession to override the national interest. Now, the DA asks, why was Parliament not briefed? Why was there no inter-party task force to defend South Africa's trade? And why are our diplomats mute on the billions that are at risk? Now, the DA is pointing fingers at DIRCO specifically, and many individuals now are pointing fingers at DIRCO, specifically DIRCO underneath Dangle, suggesting that it has been ideologically captured by Dangle, particularly around pro-Palestinian activism, hostility to Israel, and alignment with Russia and China. And they have argued that this has alienated the US and fractured long-standing trade relations. But you see, many fingers are pointing at DIRCO now, because DIRCO itself appears to be highly captured with Islamist-leaning individuals who are openly hostile to the West and want to align with many of the world's despots. And this news has been coming out from a variety of sectors. And what is Ramaphosa doing about it? Well, to be frank, nothing. Now, Ramaphosa has responded to the tariffs and has promised to support many of the affected businesses. But according to many industry voices, these are empty words without fiscal backing or policy clarity. So effectively, Ramaphosa says, don't worry, I'll help you guys out, but we don't have the money. And so many individuals are noticing the government hasn't announced a relief fund. They're offering export incentives, even though no one knows where this money is going to come from. They haven't defined how support would be administered, and they haven't outlined any mitigation plan. They're like, trust us, bro, we got your back, but we don't know how, we have no money. So business groups are naturally furious. Many in the export sector have warned of imminent job losses, and agricultural exporters have halted US shipments to avoid penalties, which means many of their agricultural exports, fruit and so forth, will go fraught. Now, one has to ask the question, does the government care about the imminent job losses? Well, the answer is no. They really don't. Now, some ANC pundits, the usual brain sparks of the ANC, have suggested that perhaps one of the ways that we could get back at America is by punishing the US by halting exports of strategic minerals such as chrome, platinum, and manganese. And many have to ask the question, this is the logic of these people. They are just literally retarded in the head. There's nothing on here. Now, this idea is economically unfeasible. You couldn't do it without collapsing the place. South Africa depends heavily on export revenues, and global buyers can pivot, yes, but South Africa can't just replace the US market overnight. So retaliation would hurt us far more than it would the US. But you see, this is the way these people think. Just retarded. Now, just to be clear, not everything was sanctioned up the wazoo. There were some essential minerals that are tied to green energy, like lithium and other rare earth elements, that were exempted or not included in the tariff list. Now, this is a strategic move by the US to avoid penalizing sectors that they specifically rely on and to maintain strategic access to these minerals, but it still sends a clear political message to Pretoria. And that is, we have no mercy for South Africa. The US hasn't just punished South Africa economically, they've sent a diplomatic signal. We are not friends anymore. The ANC's arrogance and ideological posturing and refusal to engage in a pragmatic way with its largest investor and trade partner has now cost thousands of jobs, billions in GDP, and potentially our future AGOA eligibility. To be frank, AGOA is pretty much dead now anyway because of the tariffs. Now, the ANC has for the longest time suggested that it is a non-aligned power. And despite these lovely little words, they now find itself to be isolated, economically exposed, and diplomatically embarrassed. The US has played hardball, and South Africa brought slogans to a trade war. In many instances, they thought they would be able to bet on their struggle credentials and that somehow this would just, fix everything. But it hasn't worked. And to a large degree, the reason it hasn't worked, and it's so important to understand why it hasn't worked, is primarily because DIRCO itself, by all intents and purposes, has been captured by Muslim Brotherhood ideology. Now, you have to understand Muslim Brotherhood ideology in order to understand why DIRCO has done what it has done. And to a large degree, the core beliefs of the Muslim Brotherhood are that Islam itself is not just a religion, it's a way of life. It's a way to seek the implementation of Sharia law in terms of governance, law, education, and social life. Now, the primary objective is to restore the caliphate obviously following the fall of the Ottoman Caliphate in 1924. The idea being to unite Muslims underneath a new caliphate. Now, the idea is that you can do this by starting to change society from an individual or moral perspective. So you start with the family and then society, and then you move on to the state. And how you do this is you advocate for dawah, which is Islamic missionary work and grassroots community building. Now, for you to understand that, all you got to think about is gift to the givers. Now, the entire Brotherhood's objective is that they strongly oppose secular nationalism, any form of colonialism, Western cultural influence in Muslim lands, and they see Western models of governance as being completely contrary to Islamic principles. Now, how are they going to do all of this change in society? Well, it's through the idea of jihad. Now, jihad being a duty of all individuals. And in many instances, you have to understand jihad isn't just armed resistance. It is also what they consider to be spiritual struggle and social reform. Now, the Muslim Brotherhood's final objective is to support the Palestinian cause, as they consider Israel to be an occupying power. Now, Hamas itself is a direct offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, you see, there's many things in this that the ANC will hear, and they'll be like, yeah, we like that. I mean, the ideas of being anti-Western government's model, to be anti-colonial, to be anti-Western culture, specifically in the context of Pan-Africanism, and this idea of supporting the Palestinian cause are all things that the ANC individual generally tends to hear and goes, yeah, we like that. As you'll know, the ANC has long-standing ties to the Palestinian liberation movements dating back to its own struggle against apartheid. Yasser Arafat and the Palestinian liberation movement supported the ANC during its exile's years, and so they feel they have a deep emotional and ideological connection to the Palestinian cause because of their liberation policy. That's why they like the Palestinian link. Now, DIRCO itself has been heavily influenced by Marxist, anti-imperialist, and anti-Western ideology, which sees the world in terms of oppressor and oppressed. Their view is that Israel is a Western colonial outpost and Palestine is the oppressed liberation movement. Now, this lens completely overrides nuance, and it even contradicts South Africa's national interest in many respects to see things in that way, but DIRCO doesn't really care. Because as far as they're concerned, remember, Palestinian cause. Now, whilst South Africa sees itself as the voice of the global South, DIRCO often repeats many of China, Russia, and Iran's anti-American, anti-Israel, and anti-colonial talking points regardless of the complexity or the context that they're made in, which has led many individuals to note that DIRCO is not an independent institution. It's controlled by senior ANC cadres, often appointed by loyalty over any form of competence. As you'll know, Minister Pandor and others have built international reputations around their positions from DIRCO, and so backing down on any of these positions politically would be costly to their own international relations. Now, South Africa under the ANC has continued to pursue this form of moral posturing rather than any form of strategic diplomacy, and DIRCO's statements often serve domestic ideological audiences or international activist circles and not trade or geopolitical interests. Because as we've said, their ideas are deeply connected to the ideas connected to the Muslim Brotherhood. So this has led South Africa to risk its US trade, EU relations, and any investment, all by making these huge, big symbolic legal cases in The Hague that carry little to no real-world consequence for South Africa. It's not going to enhance trade. We're not going to have more jobs as a result of it. Now, the ANC and DIRCO have frequently used any form of foreign policy as a diversion from domestic failure, shifting public anger away from corruption, crime, and collapse, all so that they can use the narrative of we stand with the oppressors, and this as a whole has masked their inability to govern effectively at home. DIRCO still imagines that South Africa is a moral superpower on the world stage, despite economic decline and diplomatic irrelevance. And ultimately, what they've attempted to do is speak as if Nelson Mandela was still in charge of the country and that the world would somehow listen to Pretoria's moral voice, but the world has moved on. And many individuals are noticing that many of the key individuals running DIRCO have Islamist ideology that they're using forms of anti-Western propaganda pushed forward by many of the countries that the West doesn't necessarily find as being politically kosher. And as a result, many of the statements coming out of DIRCO show that the ANC is deeply wedded to anti-Westernism and that they have a misplaced belief in their own moral leadership, where they seem to think that they have a bigger voice in the international state, despite now being viewed as irrelevant, inflexible, and, to be honest, self-defeating. But in any case, these are all just my views. Do let me know what you think in the comment section below. You can see it's another day in retard Danistan, and to be honest, DIRCO needs to be disbanded. It is not a good place for the country. Ideological interests do not create jobs, and I really wish the ANC would see that. At this point in time, it's hard to see the ANC as being anything but anti-South African, but that's just my views. Let me know what you think in the comment section below. Until next time, bye.